I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
Mine is 4018. My sister was 4017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day. I'm Jackie Congedo. On this episode, you'll hear from two women whose lives intersected in the aftermath of the horrific attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. Patrice O'Neill is a filmmaker and activist who has worked for decades to grow more inclusive communities. Her work drew her to Pittsburgh to document the incredible community response to the shooting, which was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in the United States. There, she met Dr. Lauren Bairnsfather, who served as executive director of the Pittsburgh Holocaust Center at the time of the attack. Dr. Bairnsfather and Patrice join us to discuss Patrice's film, Repairing the World: Stories from the Tree of Life.
So Patrice O'Neill, it is so exciting to be here with you.
I'm so happy to be with you.
I'm thrilled that we get to be together in Cincinnati, and I really am interested in hearing about the origins of Not in Our Town. So maybe we'll start there.
It's a story that I think about so often, and I tell this story quite a bit, but I think it resonates now even more than it has in years previous. It's a story about a film that we made called Not in Our Town. It aired on public television in the 90s. And it's a story about a town facing a series of hate crimes and what the ordinary citizens of this community did to respond. So it starts with a white supremacist group deciding that they are going to lay claim to this town. For those of you who don't remember, it's the 90s, and the white power movement wanted to make the Northwest their homeland. Billings is the largest city in Montana, and there were a whole series of incidents. There was a police chief there at the time who was an early adherent to community policing, and he said, I can't do this alone. We have to respond to these attacks as a community. So the community gathered, and there were some remarkable leaders there at the time. And so, for example, there was a group of skinheads who would show up at a small black church, intimidating the congregation. And then members of other denominations sent their members to act in solidarity with that church, and the skinheads went away. Then there was a Native American woman's home that was plastered with racist graffiti. There was a swastika. There was a message, Indian go home, which is kind of unclear on the concept. And then 30 members of the painters union said, we can paint the house over. And they went to the house to paint it. And 100 neighbors were there to watch. And so the town is really learning, what can we do together to resist these acts of hate? The culminating event took place when a 6-year-old Jewish boy placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah. A brick was thrown through the window and it landed on his bed. And people said, this is getting more dangerous. We have to do more. And so they started printing these menorahs on paper, these menorahs, and passing them out at the dry cleaner in the quick way, and urging people to put them in their windows. And that year, 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows. Mm-hmm. And the hate crimes ceased. The white supremacists went away. And we told that story in a film in 1995. It was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. People were understanding what's at stake. Mm-hmm. And they took the name of the film and made it their own. And it was, there are remarkable stories. We can talk about it more if you'd like, about how Not in Our Town turned into a movement. It was really that story that inspired communities across the country to say, we can do this. We can do this. We can stand with our communities. We can stand up against racism, against anti-Semitism, against all forms of hate, against attacks against our LGBTQ community. And it's been remarkable to cover those stories over these past over 2 decades.
That story just gives me chills thinking of 10,000 people putting menorahs in their windows, and would be incredible to see those kinds of connections happening between people right now in this moment. And maybe we can get back to that in a minute. But we're together right now in Cincinnati because this evening there will be a screening of the Not in Our Town film, Repairing the World, Stories from the Tree of Life, which is the context of our meeting in the first place. But I wonder, why did you decide that that was the story that should be told?
So since the original Not in Our Town film, we have been following the stories of communities responding to hate. Our stories are not really about, of course they're about the dangers of hate. They are about what's happening in this moment, the complexities of any given moment, and how hate groups are using it to divide people. This story from Pittsburgh came after we had been seeing the rise in anti-Semitism over a period of time. We were traveling around the country showing our film called Waking Oak Creek about the response to the murder of 7 people at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in 2012. I was traveling with Pardeep Kalika, whose dad was killed at the time, and we started hearing, as we spoke about what was happening there, inevitably in our audiences, we asked people, what's happening in your community? As we look at this story from Wisconsin, what's happening in your community? And we started hearing more and more incidents and stories of anti-Semitism, which has never gone away. It has always been there, but this was new. This was also at a time when Jewish journalists are being attacked. When we see this rise in incidents, we're seeing it on the ground and seeing it, hearing it, and feeling it from people in our audience. And, then so as the journalist A.C. Thompson says in the film, when the horrific attack happened at Tree of Life on October 27th, 2018, it was so horrible, but it wasn't surprising. It wasn't surprising. It was an atmosphere in the world that was being absorbed. Clearly, if you followed the trial of the man who was just sentenced to death in the attack on Tree of Life, it had been spreading over social media. So, but it wasn't the horrible nature of the attack or the fact that it was the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. It was the response from Pittsburgh that drew us to the community to see if we could make a film about what was happening there. It was the tremendous response of the whole community to this attack.
And I can't wait for people to see this film tonight and hear the story of these incredible things that happened in my city. It's my hometown. But I wonder, because I know that very soon after the event, you were on the ground already shooting footage. So I wonder what your process is like as a filmmaker when, after you see that something's happening that is a fit for the work that you do, tracing community responses.
I do want to talk about that, but I want to ask you, as someone who has studied the Holocaust and studied this a good portion of your life, you are living in Pittsburgh when this happens. Yeah. And what are you, obviously, it must have been tremendously traumatic, but what are you thinking as you see, you've studied what's happened, you try to take that into the world and share that with, so that people can have a deeper understanding of why we need to pay attention to the Holocaust, why Holocaust education is so important. Mm-hmm. And then 11 people are murdered in your town in a synagogue in a horrific attack. What is that? What are you, can you just tell us what you're thinking and the implications for your work as this is happening in Pittsburgh?
Wow. So at the time, I was the executive director of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh. And we too had been watching rising anti-Semitism, rising anti-immigrant refugee sentiment out in the open. We served Holocaust survivors, their families, teachers, students, and we had a role in the community too. And in that moment, that very day, I was picking up a Holocaust survivor who was coming to Pittsburgh from Chicagoland, from Skokie, to do an event with us the next night. And so that very day, I just snapped into motion right away. And I had a call that morning. Magda Brown of blessed memory was the survivor who was coming, and her daughter was with her at O'Hare. Waiting to board the plane, and they could see on the television that there was an active shooter at the Tree of Life building, and across the street a sign for Chatham University, which was where our event was going to be the next night. So I was right into motion, talking to Rochelle, Magda's daughter, saying, I don't know what's happening. I'll understand if you don't want to come, but I sure hope you will. She left it up to her mother, the Holocaust survivor, and Magda said, now it's more important than ever, let's go. And she walked onto the airplane. So right away, I was thinking, how do we serve the community? We ended up having to move that event to a larger venue. About 400 people walked to the chapel at Chatham University to hear a Holocaust survivor the next day. And her message was one of hope and kindness, and you stand firm when people will harm you, but you don't let that shape who you are as a person. And that gave us what we needed to continue to serve the community.
And in the following months and years, I'm sure it's shaping what you're thinking about again, how to serve the community, and what does Holocaust education mean? In the film, you talk about that.
Yes. Well, it was hard not to feel like we had done something wrong or we hadn't done enough when we saw this surge of anti-Semitism. And many people in my generation have shared with me that they didn't feel like they faced a lot of anti-Semitism. That was my experience too. So to see it become this violent and deadly thing in my city while I was in this community role was just, something that I had to think, what could we do that would stop this from happening? Deeply painful to see the anti-Semitism all around us now. So as I say in the film, I felt like we had failed to tell people that there's still anti-Semitism, because people who were learning from us about the Holocaust learned about 1933 to 1945, and they felt like anti-Semitism happened under the Nazis and then it was done, when of course it started thousands of years ago and is unfortunately quite visibly still with us. So I'm always thinking about how can we do more within the context of what we're doing. How can we share really meaningful, important information that might have seemed a little bit out of scope but really wasn't? So even today as I sit here, I'm still thinking, how can we do more? How can we do better? What have we left out that people really need to know?
Well, I think that's a sign of a great educator, is that of course we think, I feel that way too. I find it hard to sleep these days, right? I find it hard to sleep to think about what could we be doing, what more can we do, and at the same time, I think we all do what we can, and that spirit of each of us finding a way to take our own strength, our own skills and abilities, and bring it to this larger work to repair the world, to think about how we stand up to hate in any given moment when we are faced with it. I think that's a quest for all of us, right?
And a challenge for all of us, right? Because we're hurting. I know that so many people are hurting right now, which sometimes we just want to hide, but it's not a good time to hide. Now is when we really need to use our networks and think about how we can remain hopeful, how we can retain our belief in humanity, right? Which is a large part of the work that happens here, is about humanity. And that's, if we can just keep that connection and remember that even when we wake up at night?
I think narratives of hope are what we need more than ever, which is why I feel so grateful to have been able to share some portion of Pittsburgh's story in this film, Repairing the World. It really, I think when I hear members of the audience speak about this, about seeing the film and knowing that they come to a film knowing they're going to see a film about a horrific massacre, but they do it, I think, with the understanding that they're going to learn something about what happened in Pittsburgh and see a community response, and then they leave with hope. That to me is an incredible sign of success, and that we have been able to share what we felt from Pittsburgh, what we felt, that there is incredible hope and inspiration from community action, from the work that we can do together, the connections that were built, the relationships that were built to respond to the attack, but also to continue to respond no matter who the target is. And I love that about this story. I love that about your town and about the relationships that were built before to make this possible.
We had so many conversations in Pittsburgh in the aftermath where I would introduce a program and I would say, look, if you're not safe, I'm not safe. And if I'm not safe, you're not safe. And there was a real understanding that we had to be there for each other. I want to talk for a minute about what happens after the film. And at the Holocaust and Humanity Center, they talk about the ripple effect. One action leads to all of these other actions. Well, I had the privilege of seeing some school groups see the film and then talk to them afterward. And I would love for you to talk about what that has meant for you and tell everyone what's happened in Pittsburgh with students, with schools who have seen the film and what they're doing now.
I want to talk about the ripple effect a little bit more with the Not in Our Town movement, and because I think it's, this film, Repairing the World, does not come out of nowhere. It is part of a history of films that we've been doing for many years, and we don't do our films are not meant to be in film festivals or on television, and that's it. People have the experience, they watch the film, they walk away, hopefully with hope and inspiration. Our films are designed to spark conversation, to engage people, to make them think, who am I in the story and what can I do? And there are a couple of stories that just come to mind now as I think about this moment also, about, people seeing the film, the Not in Our Town story, and saying, that could be me. And I remember a couple of them that I'll just tell briefly, and hopefully there's, they'll resonate. One was a nurse who saw the Not in Our Town story in Wisconsin, and she was very inspired by it. She carried it with her, and then she moved to Greenville, South Carolina. When she moved there, she noticed that her town was one of the few places in the United States that still didn't celebrate the Martin Luther King holiday. And so she went to her pastor, who went to Lottie Gibson on the county commission, a black leader in the community for many years. And she told her about Not in Our Town, and they started a Not in Our Town movement. And that led to this massive movement to fight for the Martin Luther King holiday. And of course they won. And it was incredibly powerful. It's also, I think, what led to us responding when the attack at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin happened. So people started knowing Not in Our Town. That was, they understood that we work with communities, we work with schools, that our films are designed to spark these conversations and action. So it was the day after a white supremacist gunman went into the Sikh temple and shot people, eventually killing 7. And we got a call from the city of Oak Creek, Wisconsin. They said, okay, what should we do? And we started this conversation with them, and we learned that they were, first of all, listening to the Sikh community, that they were working in concert with them, that they were in relationship with them. And we said, you are doing everything right. We want to come there. We want to be there with our cameras. And that led to our film and this long-term relationship with the community of Oak Creek and Milwaukee, and Pardeep Kalika, whose dad was killed at the Sikh temple, is now one of the key leaders of Not in Our Town. So there is this incredible ripple effect from the stories that I are baked into our process, right? We ask people, when we thought about doing the story of repairing the world, we first wanted to speak to people in the community. Is this something that you want? Would you want to participate in a film like this? So we went to meet the Mallinger family, who lost their beloved mother and Bubby, Rose Mallinger, 97 years old. Rabbi Myers said, the rabbi of Tree of Life's congregation said, how can you gun down a 97-year-old woman who reads the prayer for peace every Shabbat and means it? I mean, I think we take that to heart now so often. And so we met with the Mallingers and talked to them about whether they'd be willing. And then with almost everyone that we interviewed, we shared our stories and said, would you like to participate? And it is that process of learning from and listening to people who are most harmed that drives our work. And I think it helped us, it helped inform our work. That's how I met you, yes. Lauren, right?
Yes.
It's like, tell us what's happening. We need to learn from you. And I learned so much from you, right? So that's the ripple effect. And so it has always been our intention for this film to be used broadly, to as we're making the film, we see all of these complicated issues emerging around the country. Remember, the 3 years that we're filming, it is, the pandemic happens, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of racist violence and hate crimes, the attacks on Asian Americans, COVID, and this incredible pandemic that occurs. And so all of these things are taking place as the white power movement is intermingling the attack on immigrants and Jews and racism. Like, that is their driving force, is blaming Jewish people for what they call the displacement of white Europeans from the United States and European countries. So it's an incredibly complicated time. So how can we tell a story that can help people unpack this? Again, one of the reasons that we wanted to speak with you, so that viewers can unpack and try to understand the context of this crime, the context of the Holocaust, the context of thousands of years of anti-Semitism, and or want to learn more. But having young people engage with this content, that was always part of the purpose of this film. And so I think you know this, but the Eradicate Hate Global Summit was one of the outcomes. There was a leading group of people who said Pittsburgh can be a leading place to understand how we can stop hate in the world. And the Eradicate Hate Global Summit became part of that response. And we showed the film in 2022, and we showed it to a group of high school students, and there was just this powerful response. I remember very well a young woman, she identified as Hispanic, and she started weeping, and she said, I didn't understand about anti-Semitism. And this film, I learned so much, but I saw myself in this story. I saw myself in this story. And she and her, we were outside talking to some of these other students who I identified as LGBTQ, and they said, I wish our parents could see this movie. And there was a teacher who was standing near there, and she said, I think we can make that happen. Those students went back to their school, the teacher went with them as an advocate, and they started a conversation about what they could do to share this story. They started an Eradicate Hate Club. Allegheny County schools learned about it. They brought 15 schools back to the Eradicate Hate Summit this year, or in 2023, and all of those schools all 150 students are part of planning what they will do to help eradicate hate and take repairing the world into their schools. So it's been really tremendous to see the impact of the story and how young people are taking it into their lives.
And how they're leading with it, and that there are school administrators and teachers who have embraced that and want to give students that power is so wonderful, because it's a different perspective, and they are inheriting a world that is rife with problems, but they're ready.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to be there in 2022 and see the students' response. And I know, because I've been in touch with that school since then, this is South Allegheny, close to where I grew up, that right away the Eradicate Hate Summit was in September, and then it was Hispanic Heritage Month, and her school did a massive Hispanic Heritage Month celebration.
And they had never done it before.
They had never done it before. And there are very few Latino students at that school, and it was a chance for them really to be seen and heard and recognized. And it's also been an opportunity for teachers who are in different minority groups at that school to be recognized and valued, and it's changing that community.
When we premiered the just before the broadcast, we did a pre-screening at WQED, and the film premiered at the Pittsburgh Jewish Film Festival. We're so grateful for that. But Adriana was there at that screening, and she said, "This film changed my life." And she said, "I found my voice." And I think, as you say, how can we give young people the voice to speak about how to stand up together? And I'm really excited about what can happen as young people start having this conversation.
Definitely, and giving them that space and listening to them.
It's part of the message of the film and what we learned. There's a scene in the film that I really appreciate. There's black and white students and sort of multiracial students having a discussion in a classroom at Alderdice High School, and one of the students says, "We need to have." They had a discussion on anti-Semitism, and then they had a discussion on racism and redlining. And she said, "This was really an important conversation for us because as young people, we don't get to have them. There's very, very rarely an opportunity to have these difficult conversations. And then you just go back to the people that you know, and you don't have those conversations. So we need to create space for that." And I really appreciated their leadership and their voice in the story to encourage their teachers and their administrators to support them in that endeavor.
It's incredible. And there are such wonderful teachers. I'm sure there are everywhere. I happen to know a lot of them in the Pittsburgh area. And I really value their response after the shooting at the Tree of Life building, that they wanted to help their students understand. But more than that, they wanted to be involved in the work.
And I think context is so important at this moment, right? And what you do as a Holocaust educator. How can we give young people the context to have discussions at this moment when people are deeply divided and don't perhaps understand what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Israel and Gaza, what's happening, and how can we and I'm asking that to you. What kind of context do you see as a Holocaust educator that's important for young people to have as they begin to have these discussions?
Yeah, there are a couple of tools that I want young people and all people to have. And one is, of course, critical thinking, which we know is something that students gain from Holocaust education. The other is media literacy. So important to understand what your sources are. Are they reliable? It's even harder now with the 24-hour news cycle and sound bites and how quickly video footage hits the airwaves, and we don't know what it is, but everyone's talking about it in a tone that seems so reliable and honest and trustworthy. Social media makes it very difficult to sort of separate fact from fiction, but there are tools that people can learn and use So that's really important too. There's one thing that comes directly from learning about the Holocaust. I was lucky enough to be involved in some conversations with educators from this area, from around Cincinnati, and with the people who work at the Holocaust and Humanities Center, guiding visitors who come to the museum. And I said, please take them to the propaganda section of your exhibit. And I talk about propaganda in the film that we're going to see tonight as well.
You too.
There is so much propaganda everywhere right now, and it's so harmful. So to be able to recognize when you're being seduced by propaganda, because it's very seductive or it wouldn't work, but to be able to understand that what you're seeing is not real, not reliable, that it was created in a certain way to seduce you into a way of thinking, and to be able to shut that down. And we've taught about that forever as part of Holocaust education. Never in my life have I seen such successful propaganda. It's really chilling. But I'm hopeful because I know that we have the power as human beings to recognize when we're being manipulated. We just need to be given the tools and also the permission to say, that is not reliable. I'm not going to believe that. I'm not going to share that. I'm not going to click on that, etc.
Disinformation and dehumanization is incredibly dangerous, and giving young people that context. And I'm so heartened. I remember, the classroom scene from Abernworth, and this teacher, middle school class, who's doing a Holocaust literature section for her middle school students, and the way they responded and were able to understand. I remember her asking one of the students, all right, so we're talking about what the motive might have been for the man who's accused of committing this attack. How do we know? How do we verify? Well, we verified it through his social media. So the students are being asked to verify the truth of social media postings and information that they're giving and sharing. And I really appreciate that so much. And you appear in a few sections in the film, again, talking about anti-Semitism, and then later in the film talking about thinking about the implications of what happened in Germany, and how, I think you say something like, the Holocaust didn't happen overnight, and that hate speech played an incredible role in the ramp up to the rise of power of the Nazis and the mass murder and the Holocaust, the loss of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others who were taken because of this horrific philosophy. And so how do we, provide that context? It just, I really appreciate your work so much.
Oh, thank you.
And appreciate what's happening in Cincinnati as we think about history, and we think about the threat to studying history in places around the country where young people are being stopped from studying Black history, from understanding things that give us the context about what's happening today, right? So you have this incredible museum here. You have the Holocaust Museum. We also have the Underground Railroad Museum here in Cincinnati. And having, the ability for young people to see and understand the history that can give them the tools they need to be upstanders.
Yes.
And we were talking about this concept of being upstanders, which Facing History and Ourselves helped coin, and I really love that idea. But that understanding, I think, gives us so much more power.
Absolutely, and I'm so excited that the film was available for many people to see during the month of October on television, because for people who watch it, it opens that conversation. It has a lot of explanatory power, very powerful scenes from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, and an explanation of what was happening there. And it started that conversation. And I'm like a broken record because I love the power of students. But when students say, I want my parents to see this, and the parents show up for a community screening, and then they're talking about things that maybe they couldn't talk about before, it's the students and the kids are shaping the conversation now at the dining room table. as has happened in the history of our fine country and has moved us forward, when we can have these hard conversations and when we face the facts of our history. I'm really just 100% in favor of fact-based teaching and respecting what happened historically, and there are facts.
Yeah, there are indeed.
There are facts.
Well, so the film is available for a limited time on pbs.org, so people can see it, but encouraging school-based discussions and community discussions with this film, that's what we want to do. Our goal is for this film to be used for many years to come, and people can sign up for a free screening in their community and convene people and have this discussion. We hope we have sort of separate guides where they can talk about hate speech. How do we don't have to change the Constitution to curb hate speech in our communities. We can think about what we can do in our everyday lives. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think our role in this larger battle against hate is to try to connect communities and give them stories that will prompt conversation about what's happening in their own communities and their own lives.
I actually had a question about the First Amendment. This has come up in a couple of programs that I've been part of, mostly with lawyers, where we think about, say, a protest that maybe is using language that's associated with hate or is clearly using hate speech on a campus, like is happening all over the country right now. And that was specifically the question, and most of the panelists were saying, well, it's protected, it's First Amendment. And while I'm not going to take on lawyers on the First Amendment, I did ask them a question about safety, and that's the question that I have for you. Do you have thoughts about how we can exercise our First Amendment rights and still ensure the safety of people in the community?
So many thoughts. I mean, I do think that this discussion, remember the First Amendment is free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. It is many things. It was meant to protect individual rights, but also democracy, right? And I think it's, what many people have been most concerned about is the right to political speech, and that I think people feel strongly that needs to be protected, understandably. And with all deep respect for the attorneys that are involved in these conversations, this Constitution, this right, this right we have needs to live and breathe in our communities. And we need to take that discussion to our communities. There's a reflection by one of the philosophy professors at Carnegie Mellon in the film that I think is so important, and we do an extended interview with him where he thinks about, of course, we want to understand, our emphasis when we talk about the First Amendment is the freedom of the speaker, but what about the freedom of the hearer and the freedom of those who have been harmed? And, I think about, for people who think about free speech, there is this sort of tendency, it's like, I have the right to say whatever I want, whenever I want. What about the rights and the incredible trauma of hate speech and harm, particularly speech that may not walk the legal line, but is essentially inciting violence? So when you see when you look at the film and you see some of the material that is emerging from the man who, on the social media posts of the man who killed 11 people and wounded others in traumatized communities across the country and around the world, when you see his posts, it may not cross the legal line. But what is the responsibility of the social media platforms, who are private companies who can control hate speech? I think ultimately we have to take this conversation back to our communities. What are we doing when we see harmful speech on Nextdoor or on social media? What are we doing to respond? Not to get into a battle about it, but what is acceptable? What are the values of our town as we speak about this? How are we taking it to our kitchen table, to our town halls? How are we taking this discussion? And I do think that The Constitution is a living, breathing document. Remember, when the Constitution was formed, women didn't have the right to vote and black people were slaves. So it has evolved, it has changed. And I think that there is absolutely a way to retain those fundamental rights to speak, to carry on public discourse that is protected, and still acknowledge the pain and the trauma of hate speech, particularly speech that leads to violence.
It's just talking about trauma. You talked about the way that you got to know people in Pittsburgh before you interviewed a single person. And that was something that made an impression on me at the time. It was so considerate of our trauma. You were so gentle with everyone. And I think it comes across in the film, the level of trust that you built with people in Pittsburgh. And that's just a comment. This isn't a question. I want to thank you for that. Because that's something that we didn't see from very many people in the aftermath. We saw a lot of people wanting to tell our story and explain to us what our trauma felt like. And I suspect that that happens in every community that experiences mass violence, and I wish that there were fewer of them, but unfortunately there have been so many more since then. I had a presentation where I ended with different mass shootings, and I said, I just can't keep up. So, I mean, that's the climate that we're living in now. And
understanding, I think, for us, putting the spotlight on those who were harmed in a way that they feel comfortable sharing and letting their stories emerge is at the center of our work. We didn't really start this process of filming. We filmed in the immediate days. Shireen Salas, my filmmaking partner, was there several days afterwards. But most of the interviews with the families and happened 6 months later, because there is a period of time of trying to process. We know this, right? Trying to process the grief and trying to think about this, and then asking who would want to participate. So it is a long process, and but the power and the strength that comes from those voices, they just helped guide the film and helped guide everything that we did in Pittsburgh.
So the conversation that we're having now will be included under the theme of connection. And it seems like there were connections between people in the Squirrel Hill community before the shooting. But it took this event maybe to bring it into focus. So we talked about this also in the context of the clergy who are featured in the film. I just wonder, how you observed the connections between the people in Pittsburgh.
Well, so I think it was probably I believe it was the Sunday after the attack. There was a massive interfaith rally in the city of Pittsburgh. You don't do that on a dime. Right. Those relationships were there. There is so much to learn from the city of Pittsburgh about the relationships, both in the Jewish community, the cohesion of the groups who responded immediately, and the relationships that each of those organizations had built, and the relationships, both interfaith and secular, that existed, that made that possible, that made that community response. I know you. You are my neighbor. So Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, is from Pittsburgh. That's that incredible children's series, Mr. Rogers, a neighborhood, emerged from the city of Pittsburgh. And I think people take kindness very seriously there. And you could feel it. You could really feel it.
I've lived in many places, even though I grew up in the Pittsburgh area, and when I moved back, I could feel that. I could see that nonprofits work together, that it was possible to build bridges across perceived differences, basically by just showing up. It was pretty easy. Like a baseline of, yes, kindness, as you say, and a certain amount of trust in people's intentions.
I think I think those relationships are being tested. They will be tested in the months and years ahead. And we have to be mindful of the essential connections that brought us together in the first place. I think about this with Not in Our Town.
Yes.
What is it? What is our shared humanity? What is our shared commitment? So we, as part of our work with Not in Our Town, we work with cities, mostly in California, but around the country, for a program that happens every year called United Against Hate Week. And there was a city employee who was talking about, this time period and the challenges. And she said at first when she brought it up, it was so easy, and then people were shying away. What does United Against Hate mean in this moment? It means we have to be there for each other no matter what. And it is difficult. It is really hard when there are deep disagreements. Mm-hmm. How do we come together? How do we learn about each other and listen to each other and make this strong commitment to our shared humanity? And that's what I really appreciate about what you're trying to do, and understand that. So in the days after October 7th, Maya Wiley, who leads the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, sent a message to a group of us who are part of the Hate Crimes Coalition. And the message that I keep repeating that resonated so strongly with me is, our compassion is our strength. Our compassion is our strength. And I think we have to keep that with us now and always.
The other thing that we learned how to do a lot better in the aftermath of the shooting at the Tree of Life. So you're talking about the October 7th Hamas attack in Israel. After the shooting at the Tree of Life, we all got better at active listening. People like to talk, but we got a lot better at listening and appreciating other people's experiences. And I learned a lot from that experience that I'm using in this moment. And I love the quote that you just shared, that our ability to make the connections that we're talking about and build real relationships. Some of the relationships that we lean on social media aren't the kind of relationships that you can build sitting across the table from each other like we're doing right now. And that's the power of local community work, right? That it's real.
Yeah.
It's and powerful, even when we're in a climate where people are disagreeing about things that are deeply important to them. Yeah. And other voices, and maybe it's not as deeply important. We need to listen to the people who are really connected to the things that are happening through that trauma lens and understand how painful this moment is, and show up with our compassion. I love that. I'll remember that. Yeah. So I'll ask you one last thing. I could talk to you for hours.
I could talk to you for hours.
I mean, days even. But we mentioned upstanders briefly, and I'm just wondering what you saw in the people of Pittsburgh that has stayed with you.
I think what carried forward is this was the period of time that we covered in the film. There were so many really complex problems that emerged at this time. People were just grappling with, what did it mean when the white supremacists were chanting, "Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville, and then understanding what it means after October 27th. What does that mean? How do we unpack that? How do we understand the threat of white nationalists, white supremacists, that white power movement? How do we understand the role of hate speech? And so you saw the community of Pittsburgh saying, let's talk about this. Let's have these conversations. How can we think about these weapons of mass destruction that are taking lives in our communities like ours? What do we do about that? We saw the city of Pittsburgh try to curb the use of automatic weapons in the city of Pittsburgh, curb the use, not ban them, just curb the use. So, we saw the need for and the desire to develop these relationships. And we saw the Jewish community showing up over and over again in support of other communities that were harmed. We saw these relationships being built. When COVID happened, how do we maintain relationships with each other? And I really so appreciated learning from Pittsburgh as we are speaking with communities across the country about how to respond to these moments, the division in the election in 2020. And we had our eyes on Pittsburgh and continued to learn from them. And I know that we will again for many years to come.
Thank you so much.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling and is generously supported by Margaret and Michael Valentine. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Videography and editing by Michael Holder. Select music by Kik Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center in Cincinnati, Ohio.